We have just begun our session on irregular migration. So this is a little table that gives a hint of some snapshots. Interestingly, the most recent concrete estimates of irregular migration coming from organizations like the International Organization for Migration, the IOM, they put out annual reports, and it seems like the last report where they even hazarded these sorts of estimates was 2018. In the subsequent annual reports, you can't find any concrete estimates. And I think it's because there's been a lot of scholarship pointing to just how problematic and challenging it is to put forward these numbers with any confidence. But here's an example of some estimates. And you can see here that the US number around 11 million, maybe the next highest is estimated to be the European Union with around 8 million. The Russian Federation has a lot with 5 to 6 million, but there's an asterisk on that, which says that that refers only to migrant workers, so the number would be even higher in Russia. So just a glimpse of some of the estimates of unauthorized residents within these countries or regions. Unauthorized migration carries a lot of costs. There's, on the one hand, there's the social stigma of being an alien or an irregular or undocumented or illegal. And this can come with all sorts of social community exclusion, sense of ostracism, but also very serious political risks to your well-being, because detection by government agencies, if you end up in a traffic stop and are asked to produce ID or situations like that, can result in penalties and potentially even deportation. And migrating illegally is a deadly business. We've mentioned before something like 67,000 migrants have gone missing. These are not extrapolations or estimates. These are, each of the statistics in this figure have names attached to them. These are particular people who have gone missing. So this is the absolute low end of estimation of how many migrants go missing or die in transit. And this, think especially of the Mediterranean Sea. In fact, we can just go forward one more. The Missing Migrants Project has a website. They're embedded with the IOM, and they track these numbers. And as it says here, the records are since 2014 of people who die in the process of migration towards an international destination, regardless of their legal status. Okay, I suspect that a majority of those who are dying have dubious or shaky legal status. I'm not sure exactly how that factors into this number. Now, as collecting information is challenging, all figures remain undercounts. The locations in most cases are approximate. Each number represents a person as well as the family and community that they leave behind. So these are real people who have gone missing or been known to die. And as I ask in the last point on this slide, is this a kind of structural oppression? What about, we think of forms of structural oppression long ago in the days of slavery, or not so long ago in the Jim Crow regime in the US, which kept African Americans as second-class citizens, restricted civil rights, restricted political rights, really right up through the civil rights movement of the 1960s. We think about things like women's liberation movement, the oppressive structures of patriarchy. We think about South African apartheid, a system that was deemed, a major structural oppression. And many of these are eventually overcome, and they face great challenges as these movements to challenge these forms of structural oppression are often vilified or controversial in their time, but as progress is made and rights are expanded, and very often enfranchisement, the extension of the right to vote, the extension of political rights, marches forward. And before too long, we look back and it seemed, well, of course it's obvious those were structures of oppression. We need to move towards liberation. And in hindsight, things always look pretty clear. But if we ever ask ourselves, what are some of the maybe great structural injustices that we're not talking about today that we might look back on 20 or 100 years later with a bit more moral clarity? So let's go forward a little bit. I pose at the top of this slide again this question: is this structural oppression? And I want you to think about the numbers of those unauthorized individuals and the precarious situations that they're in, and couple that with what we've been talking about with asylum seekers and refugees and the massive numbers, what is it, something like 40 or 50 million displaced people across borders whose lives are, very much in limbo and subject to the whims of things that most people, many of us, can't even begin to imagine. Is this a kind of global apartheid? That some people can travel more freely than ever, but based on the lottery of national birth, where you're born or who you're born to, will determine whether or not you get to play in this world of globalization. Mm-hmm. And it's not just the inequalities of globalization that have produced the greatest gap in wealth that human history has ever known today between the wealthiest and the most desperate or least wealthy, but there's still these living legacies of colonialism and imperialism that are not disconnected from the present in the distant history, in distant past. These continue to be structures that operate sometimes formally, but often informally through coercive economic relations and just the clout of the major world powers that are able to continue to maintain relationships with parts of the world and other countries that are exploitive of their local economies or oppose the democratic will of many countries. Very often, Western governments are using not just the levers of the economy, but their military power and their military budgets and their intelligence agencies to prop up undemocratic governments that happen to suit their foreign policy, whether it's trade or security, and at the expense of local populations who are often struggling in pro-democracy movements, not just against their own dictators, but against the foreign policy of the most powerful countries in the world. And you don't have to look too far to see examples of this. It's not common knowledge, I think, in the general public. Maybe it's changing a little bit, but the Western powers today and throughout modern history have supported some of the most oppressive dictatorial regimes in history. We think about just today across the Middle East, probably about half the dictatorships are completely dependent on continued Western support and would begin to crumble and fall and give way to democratic pressures from below, were they not able to secure their position of power over their people and indeed repress, surveil, and control their populations, sometimes with Western technologies that they buy or are given. So I'm raising this question, and this question is being raised, I think, increasingly in the literature. And the second reading for today, I think, is really getting at this question. Is there a kind of global apartheid that warrants a sort of a new civil rights movement, a new expansion of political inclusion that seems perhaps unthinkable today, but could perhaps in the future seem like the next logical expansion of the bounds of political community, to move beyond the nation state and this paradigm that we have, these presuppositions that the nation is the category by which we are happy to say these people don't get in and these people do. These people get rights and these people don't. And the predominant criteria for determining that is nationalism. Of course, borders are the instrument, but nationalism is the ideology that seems to justify that those who happen to already be here enjoy all sorts of privilege and security that those who are not born there don't receive. And very often, it needs to be put at the outset, most of these irregular migrants are probably not political, would not consider themselves political, would not consider where they're living or their crossing of borders as political acts. They're trying to feed their family, they have economic interests, they are trying to reunite with family, but it's hard to escape the political undertones of the very status of being undocumented, or the very political undertones of crossing a border in defiance of established border regimes. So while often not political overtly, I think it's always implicitly political. And your very existence itself becomes a deliberate defiance of border exclusivity. So it's not just that you're violating the law or you're doing some stealing or shoplifting because you're when you break some laws, you're not challenging the system. You're pursuing maybe your private concerns and private interests, and you don't think politically. But when your whole existence itself becomes a defiance of a political regime, I think it becomes in a way a much greater degree political. And of course, sometimes it is overtly political. So I want to, having just revisited this notion of irregular migration and some of the structural challenges facing so many millions of people around the world, to look at when the very clear, obvious examples of where irregular migration completely moves into the realm of the political by looking at some cases, some major historical contemporary cases of border protest, of of bodies defying borders with political motives and political messages. I'll run through a few prominent cases that most people are familiar with. We talked already a little bit about the case of the Jewish refugees in Europe after World War II. So here's a case, a mass case of irregular migration, with hundreds of thousands of European Jews smuggled in or moved clandestinely into the country during maybe beginning in the very late 1930s, but extending through the 40s up until 1948. When the British Empire that was controlling Palestine at the time, for its own political reasons, the British had decided that they were at that time not going to support continued Zionist immigration into the country, and they closed the borders. And so the Jewish people couldn't believe in Europe that at the time of their greatest need, their British patron, who they thought was a supporter of the creation of a Jewish state and supported the Zionist movement, had now closed all their borders and were in fact turning away ships that were packed with overpacked with thousands of displaced Jewish people from Europe, sending them back. Countries across the West were not accepting Jewish refugees. And we just have, for example, a New York Times headline here: Cyprus ship forced back to Haifa by bomb blasts. There's some complex history here. So a ship had shown up on the coast of what would become Israel. The British turn it away, and then there's a bomb blast because there are also some Jewish extremists who are trying to influence the policies at the time. You see some snapshots here of desperate people packed onto these boats. The banner on the top right reads, "The Germans destroyed our families and homes. Don't you destroy our hopes." In English, a message to the British world, a message to the West saying, we need your help now. Don't continue what the Germans were doing to us. So this is it's called, the slide is labeled here, Aliyah B, because Aliyah is the Jewish term that is associated with Jewish people making the return to the Holy Land. Sort of, it's like almost like a pilgrimage kind of place in Jewish thought and culture. Aliyah is to migrate to the Holy Land and set up Jewish communities there. And throughout the first half of the 20th century, the British facilitated it. The British really made it happen beginning in the post-World War I period. And for about 20 years, the British effectively supported Zionism and funded and to help the Jewish communities in the country develop their governance institutions. The Jewish population in the country of Palestine during this time rose from 1/10 of the population, with the other 9/10 being Arab Christians and Arab Muslims, predominantly Arab Muslims. But 1/10 was Jewish, and by the time of the Second World War and the Holocaust, the Jewish population in Palestine had risen from 1/10 to 1/3 of the population, mostly due to the European migration facilitated by the British in the preceding decades. And so here they closed the borders, but this is a powerful case of when irregular migration is tied to a national liberation movement and has these sort of world historic consequences of feeding into the ultimate creation of the state of Israel in 1948. So and it's referred to in Jewish history and by the organizers at the time as Aliyah B, as in Plan B. The British closed the gates on us. We're going to go in the back door. We're going to smuggle in. We're going to sneak in. So Aliyah B was the response to the plight of the Jewish refugees to the closure of what they thought was one of the few places in the world where they could achieve a sanctuary.
And can I just get some clarification? What was the reason for the British official reason for closing the borders?
What was the official reason for the British closing the borders? This is hotly debated, and probably the answer has to do with the British Empire. The British had tried to impose this Zionist plan to create a Jewish state in Israel, but there had been in Palestine, what was called Palestine at the time, the British Mandate for Palestine. If you want to be technical, it was called the British Mandate for Palestine because they were a colonial power sort of overseeing the country. And there had been an immense local opposition to it. And there had been a major war, a civil war fought just before World War II. And so there was a lot of opposition, and the violence was getting out of hand. And I think at one level, the British sort of thought, this isn't going to work. The local population isn't going to accept it. There's going to be a lot of internal fighting, and we're not going to be a part of imposing this solution anymore. Now, that's one aspect of it. I think another aspect of it is that it's really tough to say, but we can't rule out the fact that World War II had just begun in 1939. And so there's some speculation that as World War II began and Britain was looking for allies wherever they could find them and wanted to win over Arab countries to its side in World War II, it started to promote and espouse policies that it thought would serve its war effort. This wouldn't be inconsistent with the British Empire because they had done the same thing in World War I when they were making promises to local Arab leaders, okay, we're going to give you independence if you support us in the war. So they give like policy concessions. So it's not exactly clear to me what the overarching reason was for the British to stop supporting Zionism at that time. I don't have a good answer. If anybody else has any thoughts on that question as to why Britain seemed to reverse its Zionist policy as encapsulated in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, when the British Foreign Office basically said, we support the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. Why exactly was it reversed some 20 years later and they seem to impose these blockades on further Jewish immigration is a bit unclear to me. I'd be happy to hear anybody else's thoughts on it.
I have a question here, Michael.
Yes.
So you mentioned that Britain has imposed some restriction on the immigration to where? To Britain or to Palestine?
To Palestine.
I just want to clarify this point.
Yes, yes.
Where?
So the entire country was closed to Jewish immigration. So
Which
whether
country?
they were coming.
Which country?
Palestine.
No, this is misinformation.
No.
No,
No,
yes.
this is.
Let me just let you know something, if you don't mind,
Yes.
Michael, because
Yes.
I'm bringing also a very long and well deep research topic to this point.
Yes.
So first, I would like to comment on the photos that you post. So the first one, where is that the German destroy our families, whatever. This was a message not for the West, not for the British. If you really research these photos, you can see this was a message for the local indigenous people in Palestine who welcome the white settler, European white settler, as a refugee to their land after Germany Nazi, what they did to the Jewish people. The second photos, you can see Haganah ship. And you know what
Yes.
does it mean, Haganah? Haganah was a
yes.
terroristic, yes. So the idea and the project, the whole thing was to establish a new state facilitated by the West, particularly Britain. And you know what Balfour Declaration, it was meant to transfer most of the white Jewish population of Europe to the Middle East for other political agenda. And if you remember, Tudor Herzl, the Zionist projects, were actually looking for three countries to pick: Uganda, Argentina, and Palestine. And finally, they choose Palestine to make sure that whatever in the future, any kind of political economic benefits could align with the West agenda for controlling much of the natural resources road. So this is my point of view. I have researched this very, very thoroughly. So I want to make sure that whatever always in the media, whatever always in different books, we have to look for a different perspective. We can discuss this from different point of view that could take months, but this is my own takes for today. And I want to make sure that people know what does it mean Haganah and other Stieren, other groups, terrorist groups, Jewish terrorist
Leahy,
groups.
Stern game.
Yes. So it was actually intended to ethnic cleanse.
I absolutely,
Yes,
yes.
go ahead.
Nora, I really appreciate that perspective, and everything you say is totally true. And I don't mean to take anything away from the fact that there would be no state of Israel were it not for British imperialism. Basically, Britain created it. They repressed the local population throughout the period and allowed the Jewish institutions to build up and arm and train. And the very arms that the Western countries used in World War II, many of them were given to these groups like the Haganah after World War II. So they were in a clear position of advantage thanks to Western support. But none of that changes the peculiar fact that Britain closed this, put an absolute halt on immigration from 1939 until it handed the country over to the UN in 1947. So it is, even though Britain may have still been pro-Zionist at the time, they had stopped the policy of immigration. And you may know that they put out a paper in 1939 where they formally reversed the Balfour Declaration and called for an Arab state in 10 years. They said, we no longer support the influx of European Jews into the country, and we say there should be an Arab state here, just like there's one in Egypt and Iraq and across the region for Palestine within 10 years. Now, the Arabs didn't believe it, because again, it's wartime. Here goes the British with their convenient wartime promises again. And if you're serious about it, why 10 years? Why not now? So there's the motives of the British are absolutely suspect. But during this period from 1939 through 48, they did put the brakes on immigration into the country that exacerbated the crisis for the displaced Jewish people in Europe. And maybe that's a conversation we could continue offline outside of the class.
Yeah, but I also would like you to mention why, from your own perspective, maybe as a researcher or as a witness, because you went there for 6 months, as you mentioned, when you mention the Alaya B and you mention it from a biblical religious perspective, that
Yes.
you think, or I'm not sure, I want to actually to blame anybody here, but when you bring the idea from a religious point of view and say that this is the Holy Land or the homeland, how can you justify what you said in terms of how could Palestine, which is the Middle East, brown people, indigenous, historical relation for these people to the land, consider a holy or a homeland for a white settler, European descendant people? So I would like you to please explain to me why you mentioned this.
Yes, well, I mentioned it because this is the perspective of the people at the time, the Jewish people. Now, I am not a Zionist. I don't support Zionism, to be clear. And I don't think that the claims of the Bible, 2,000-year-old claims traced through religion back a couple of thousand years, warrant a modern 20th century immigration policy or justify anything that was done. But this is the perspective.
Yeah,
Yes.
because we cannot justify such a claim, because every other group of people can also claim their connection to the land or relationship to the land, like 30,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, whatever. So I think when we think of this issues, aside from religious beliefs, aside from biblical stories, whatever, we need to look from this as an facts, evidence, and exactly what is going on and happened, and everybody
Yes.
has to look at this, yes, with a really free from bias, free from prejudgment and stereotypes. So this is the way to look and investigate what is going on or what happened, to be honest.
Yes, absolutely. And a critical view takes all of those things into account. It's also the case that the Zionist movement, a significant part of world Jewry, did feel this way. They felt, even though they're white, on the one hand, they're speaking the language of colonialism. They're not, they speak about the Bible and they speak about this, so having some right to this land, but they're also talking about colonialism. The early Zionists are saying, we want to colonize this land. They set up departments of colonization within like the Zionist World Organization, and they spoke the language of settling the land and colonizing. It's like, we want to be a modern nation. And from the Zionist perspective, this is what modern nations do. They go around and they colonize. So I think you're right about all that. But from the perspective of the Jewish people at the time, this is how it was perceived, and this is sort of the message that got through in the Western world too. But I think we're going to offset it with a lot of Palestinian perspective too as we go. Let's see what is next. So another major case when irregular border crossing became very political. This is probably among maybe the most famous and well-known examples, is the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. This was when this event pretty much set off the end of the Cold War, when it became clear that the communist point of view had lost out among its general public in Eastern Germany, which was under Soviet control at the time. And the wall, which was meant more so to keep the East Germans in and not be able to escape to the West, which was regarded at the time as a little bit more free and more prosperous. The wall was meant to keep them in. Well, they said enough of this and they stopped believing in the wall. And in the hundreds of thousands, they marched to the wall, they took their hammers to the wall, and they said, we are not following this. And to their credit, a lot of the guards, the border guards at the time, refused orders from their higher ups to open fire on the crowds. And the fall of the Berlin Wall set in motion the events that showed the weakness of the Soviet regime. And by 1991, the Soviet Union had peacefully broken apart. And one of the catalysts was this massive act of irregular migration of people defying the border in place. Another major example, now this one doesn't exactly involve a border as explicitly, but in 2006, one of the largest mass protests up to the time in American history took place, and it was known, organized around the rally title of A Day Without Immigrants, where immigrants were supposed to show up in the streets to protest and not show up at their jobs to try to convey a message of the importance of their role to American society. So on the one hand, they're protesting for greater immigrant rights in the US, but they're also protesting against the border itself in the sense of one of the sparks that kicked off this movement was a new law that was targeting irregular migrants. It was targeting undocumented immigrants. And in response to this new law that was going to lead to more deportations of unauthorized migrants, who they're saying through this movement, we are everywhere, we're embedded in your communities. And so something like 1.5 million people took part in these demonstrations in a single day, making it at the time one of the largest protests in US history. And it's centered around a support for unauthorized migrants. Returning to Palestine. In the early years of the 21st century, Israel had begun constructing this separation barrier. And this is in the occupied West Bank. This separation barrier that Israel was building, metal fence, barbed wire, concrete slabs, surveillance towers, military checkpoints all over it. And it wasn't just a wall between Israel and the West Bank. It was a wall that ran deep inside the West Bank. And it separated not only Israel from the West Bank, it separated Israeli settlements within the West Bank from Palestinian communities. And it also separated Palestinian communities from Palestinian communities in strange looping configurations of the wall that encircled Palestinian towns and communities and cut them off from their farms, from their livelihoods, from the rest of the territory. And there was protests that arose and developed in a very grassroots way. The popular protests against the separation barrier were not directed by some of the main politicians at the time or by the Palestinian Authority itself, but by local popular resistance committees. That's people from the community stepping up to organize sort of direct action campaigns, media outreach, coordinating with international solidarity activists and foreign organizations who are supportive. And the movement is highly repressed. The movement is met with brutal crackdowns. Hundreds of people in this movement were shot and killed over, say, a 10-year period. And the amount of tear gas and local repression is the military would make incursions into the homes of the villages at night to try to arrest the organizers. And while this barrier doesn't signify a border of Israel exactly, especially to the extent that it snakes through the West Bank, it's very much experienced as a border for Palestinians. It remains a border between Israelis and Palestinians, whether they're Israeli settlers or Israelis within the official state borders of Israel. And so for Palestinians, it is a boundary that is keeping them out or keeping them caged in, and they're protesting against it. And it's not very well known that there have been a handful, maybe even several cases where the barrier was in some cases rerouted or stopped. Even the Israeli court stepped in on occasion to agree with cases that Palestinians had raised, working with Israeli activists within Israel who had access to the Israeli legal system, as Palestinians under occupation do not have access to the Israeli legal system. We're able to eventually sometimes force the hand of the IDF to demolish parts of the barrier, restore portions of Palestinian land. But this is a very small portion. The amount of what could be called small victories in the protests against the wall really pale in comparison to the amount of losses and the cost and the hardship endured. But in a national movement that is not known for having many victories against Israel and its international backers, I think in many ways this shows some of the power of popular organizing that is open and inclusive and allows for wide range of participants from young and old and men and women. You know, you didn't have to carry a gun or be an athletic young man to be part of this movement. You just had to show up in protests and demonstrations and work with international activists, and you could potentially, there were some cases where, as I said, the barrier's route was changed and some portions of land were restored, but these examples are very limited, to be sure. And notably, the contrast is none of these gains in the West Bank were achieved through armed struggle. They were achieved through unarmed struggle. But I don't want to paint the anti-wall protest movement as a success of any kind because the victories were too far and few between. And also, this was a barrier that the International Court of Justice had done an advisory opinion on and declared that it was in breach of international law and that Israel's construction of the barrier on the West Bank territory was illegal, that Israel was advised that they should tear the wall down and that they should provide reparations to the Palestinian communities affected. Of course, Israel and the West ignored that ruling in 2004.
There's a comment.
Yes, go ahead.
Online, Lily, which reads, I think considering the perspective of Jewish refugees settling Palestine after the Holocaust is instructive in terms of how it helps us understand the configuration of the settler, displaced Holocaust survivor who had recently lost everything. Were not all committed Zionists, and many arrived in Palestine with no material resources. However, the support of Western powers in the creation of the State of Israel gave Jewish settlers huge material advantage over native Palestinians, and over time, refugees were also assimilated into the Zionist state thought project. Their subjectivities changed over time to justify and codify the unequal structure created by the Israel state. I think people living in the US and Canada, including those of us descended from refugees, can be subject to similar process. And she said she shares a link of Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz interview on the subject. And then she quotes, oh, it's quite
Maybe we can park the long quotation.
either way, I'll post it on the bright space so you can read the quotation.
I want to give a little bit of insight into some of the creativity of these sorts of protests and suggest that this is where some of the power of this kind of political activism lies. It's in framing, it's in how you're able to communicate your message. If you look at these photos, they're like these are very serious situations where these activists show up with a sledgehammer and they start knocking a hole in the Israeli separation barrier. Their lives are at danger. They're at high risk to themselves. They rush in with a small team of activists. They undertake an action. They have a small number of journalists with them who are there to document the event, to get these photo shots, and then they retreat and they disperse. And this kind of imagery, this kind of photogenic, captivating, dramatic kind of imagery really dramatizes, I think, for an international audience, the type of situation the Palestinians are living under. And some of the creative ways that they've promoted this is many of their assaults on the separation barrier happened to be done on November 9th in the 2000s and the early 2010s. November 9th, and then these would go out in the media cycle on the anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So they're trying to couple their own liberation struggle in a kind of framing fashion with other social justice and civil rights movements, in this case, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And to say, look, we are in our own situation where we have our own Berlin Wall. When is ours going to fall? And it's a way of trying to, I think, humanize or recast the Palestinian struggle in terms that reach a wider international audience. And also the other thing that, not to get too sidetracked, but one thing about this form of struggle is internationals were pouring in and out of these popular committees and these Friday demonstrations where every Friday these popular committees would organize, get on the streets, and hold these marches, march to the wall, endure tear gas, and there's always reporters there. There's always international solidarity activists documenting it. And then when they leave, they go back to their communities, wherever they came from in the world, as ambassadors for the Palestinian struggle. And so I think one of the things I've been so struck by since October 7th is the massive amount of almost spontaneous organizing for Palestinian rights and Palestinian solidarity that we've seen. And I think a lot of that has come from this form of popular struggle in the West Bank that has allowed thousands and thousands of Western supporters to come in, get educated, see it firsthand, go back to their communities, and then become the seeds of these organizations in the West that are the first to jump into action when the war on Gaza kicked off. Nora, do you want to jump back in?
No, I just would like to know, I'm not sure how to connect the breaching the barriers movements with the topic of the session, which is irregular migration. I'm not able to get the point.
Yes.
Because I want to make sure when we discuss or when we give our points or opinion, we can relate it or connect it in a way to understand or to find the connection between the session and the examples that are brought in the discussion. So how West Bank anti-wall protest can be connected to the irregular immigration? Who is the irregular migrants here? Are the Palestinians or the settlers, the Israeli settlers? Who are? Please.
Yes, so it's a good question. This is why I'm trying to establish what may be a tenuous connection between the notion of irregular migration and border protest, because irregular migration rejects the authority of the state to exclude you, and it operates in other ways. This is why we say most irregular migrants are not overtly political, but sometimes they are. And in the case of the Berlin Wall, knocking a hole in it and crossing to the other side is about as irregular a form of migration as you can get. It's a defiance of the state's authority and structures to regulate who gets to come in and who gets to go out. But instead of simply doing it quietly or passively and disappearing into the society. It's doing it with a bang and doing it with a way that is bringing to light the structures of oppression. So in some ways, it's the most radical edge, the tip of the spear of irregular migration is to, with your very body, go to the border and protest and say, we think this state's ability to control our movement is illegitimate. So it has this connection to the idea of rejecting the authorities' capacity to exclude based on the border.
Yeah,
And,
but sorry,
and,
Michael.
and at the same time, coupling it to a sort of a potential, a nascent kind of global social movement where people who are moving for not for political reasons, but their numbers are still legion. They're in the millions. And many reasons that they're moving is due to these old legacies of colonial imperial structures that have created these inequalities and left communities and countries impoverished and divided and conquered, and their economies are subject to the great powers that causes these people to move in the first place. So these sorts of struggles, these anti-wall, these anti-border protests, I think are tied into the plight of the millions of undocumented people around the world. But so it's perhaps a weak connection, but I think that that you can see this is sort of an extreme, overt, politicized form of irregular migration. And this is not a well-established thing. I'm drawing on my own research here, and there is a small literature that's emerging on some of these questions. And I think that the reading that is the second reading for this session draws some of that out and provides some good sources on it. But this is a really, I would say, a nascent area of research and not well established and not well known, probably counterintuitive, and probably most people would think it's a little bit out there. But I want to really pose the question if what we're seeing sort of the beginnings of a global movement towards a broader rejection of a state's ability to exclude based on national criteria and to really actually extend and establish a human right to move. But again, this is maybe getting a bit ahead of things, or perhaps being a little bit optimistic, or maybe the formulation is a little bit off and not quite appropriate. But this is something that I'm trying to work through in my research, bringing together transnational popular protest movements with these border migration issues of unauthorized migration.
Okay.
You want to follow up?
Yes, please, because to be honest, I didn't see any connection. And I would like to mention some points that you already talked about, which is first, it's illegal war that has been dismissed by the ICC. And the other thing is that you mentioned that this wall has been built on Palestinian land that separated the Palestinian community with other Palestinian communities, and also Palestinian communities from settlements, illegal settlements. We have to agree on this too, because it has been agreed by European countries. There are illegal settlements on Palestinian land. So there is no borders here. It's actually people trying to access their own lands, their own inherited land. So the border concept doesn't apply in terms of the border separated two different sovereign countries. So this is one point. The second point that you mentioned, that people try to get in order to eliminate borders. Who said that Palestinians want to be part of the Israeli? Palestinians want their own land to establish their own countries. This is my understanding. I never said, or I never heard in any discussion that Palestinians would like to destroy the wall because they want to be part of the Israeli community or the Israeli fabric, that the social fabric. Is actually no. Palestinians want their land that has been, or they have been forced to give up to the IDF to establish this wall. So there is, in my opinion, there is no connection at all. The case doesn't apply here. This is my point. I would like to hear from other also people who thinks differently, and I would like to see the justification for this case to be presented within the irregular migration.
Sure, and let me just respond and say, I certainly never said that Palestinians want to join Israeli society. And this these cases from the West Bank challenging the separation barrier, they're not challenging an international boundary. This wall does not represent an international boundary. To the extent that it borders Israel and the West Bank, according to international law, that is Israel's recognized boundary, but most of this activism is happening inside the West Bank. Now, it's a border not in the sense of a legal international boundary or a recognized state territory, but it is a boundary or a kind of border that divides these national communities, and Palestinians are rejecting it. And one example too that I'm sure you're aware of, it's sort of related to this whole idea. In 2011, on Land Day, there were hundreds and in some cases thousands of protesters from the refugee camps around the region, I think especially Syria and Jordan, where there were actions to breach the Israeli barrier. So refugees who had been displaced since 1948 or from 1967 were marching on the Israeli border and being shot at, demonstrators were killed, and they were rejecting explicitly the Israeli international boundary, not because they wanted to become Israeli, but because they wanted to have access to their homeland. So true, the West Bank wall is not an international boundary, but it is a border imposed by a national state to restrict the movements of people who have a right to cross that wall. Did anyone else want to weigh in, share a view?
I just want to say thank you to Nora's point, because I was also thinking that we're not talking about two nations here, we're talking about
Well, we are talking about two nations, but we're not talking about two states. We're not talking about an
states.
International boundary. We're talking about two people, and one people is oppressed. One nation is oppressing another.
Lily, do you want to go ahead?
Lily.
Hi, yeah, just reiterating, I think this discussion is really important. I'm grateful for Nora's perspective, and that we're talking about this. I think it's also perhaps like relevant to consider that I think for a lot of like migrant movements that reference like Latinx migration from the Americas, they're making a similar point, not in the sense that all indigenous people to the Americas are indigenous to North America, but that national borders that are being enforced by settler colonial states like shouldn't regulate the movement of people who are indigenous to the territory and who for millennia have lived on the land and moved according to their own social structures and governing systems. And I think that that's where I see the parallel, that I don't know if that's make Michael explicit, but that's like how I was understanding what you're saying in terms of just I know I've been going to marches and stuff here in Mexico City, and that's often like a common thread that folks in Mexico are pointing out, the common experience of being contained by a wall that limits your mobility, your opportunity, your access to resources, and like what your passport is worth, what your currency is worth. I think that's an experience and a kind of solidarity that I felt moved by, and that people are definitely highlighting here, even though, I think to me, it's, I don't think it makes sense if you start from the starting place of oh, all borders are legitimate. And so Palestinians protesting a border wall shouldn't be held to the same framework because their border is illegitimate. I think people in Mexico are seeing many borders are illegitimate, not just the border in Israel and Palestine and the West Bank and in Gaza, but also the U.S. border with Mexico after the U.S. took half of Mexico's national territory in the 1800s. Mexico itself being a colonial state and many indigenous nations existing within Mexico, sending large proportions of migrants to work in the U.S. who are held as second-class citizens in a system of global apartheid that Michael is referencing.
Yes, thank you, Lily. And I also want to suggest that this type of movement of indigenous Palestinians rejecting the authority of the Israeli state to regulate and control their movement and exclude their ability to move on their historic land is, I think, an extreme form of the massive movement of irregular migrants around the world who are saying it's illegitimate that these state powers can control our movement when our rights and justice are at stake. And there's a couple of other examples outside of Palestine to touch on, but while we're so deep on the subject, I'm just going to jump ahead to 2018. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, so I'm just asking a question. So this wouldn't neatly fall into an irregular migration. This isn't really an irregular migration because we're talking about indigeneity and ownership of land.
Right. Right.
So it wouldn't fall into
It's not
modern concepts.
It's
of
not
borders.
technically irregular migration
Yeah.
because they're not migrating to another country. They're not actually succeeding in crossing that border.
Mhm.
But what they are protesting with their bodies, just like the irregular migrants who are advancing up Central and South America to the southern US border, is a rejection of the state's ability to confine and control their movement.
Mhm.
And so sometimes people can slip across the border, or unauthorized migrants, by not reporting to the immigration office or by overstaying their visa, are defying the modern day state, which has these imperial colonial legacies. They're defying their ability to have this control over their humanity. And so the Palestinians, while they're not able to break through that West Bank wall in any significant numbers, they are protesting the ability of states to control the movement of people. And irregular migration is a defiance of that state authority. And these are extreme examples of defiance of that authority.
Okay.
And while the West Bank Wall was the protests against the West Bank Wall are a relatively minor social movement in terms of the impact it made and the amount of people that participated, I think a larger case that maybe is a little bit easier to recognize would be the Great March of Return, as it was called in Gaza, that began in 2018. This was when civil society organizations across Gaza, with some governmental support within the Gaza Strip, decided to organize these weekly marches of people to the border, to Israel's internationally recognized boundary. So this isn't just a wall snaking through Gaza. This is what the international community regards as Israel's border. And thousands of people every Friday for several months, for most of the year, for most of 2018, marched en masse to the fence, to the border fence with Israel. Tens of thousands on some occasions marched to the fence. And when they marched to the fence, it was to say, this international boundary that is maintained by Israel is illegitimate, and we demand the right to pass. And as they approach the border, of course, they are shot at. Snipers are taking out people in their kneecaps, or if someone happened to have picked up a stone, they would be targeted for killing. And a number of people who were very brave and courageous and wanted to show their defiance would go close to the wall, would throw a stone, whether they were children or women or disabled people. And in fact, the individuals pictured in the lower two pictures and the image on the right, a beloved Palestinian medic, were all assassinated. They were killed by the snipers for approaching the wall. Like in the case of the woman on the lower left, Wessel Sheikh, she had told her family she was doing this, she wanted to be martyred. This was going to be her contribution to the national cause. She was going to be martyred. She went close to the border fence, took a sling and was throwing rocks, and she was killed. And these stories have been reported not just in local Palestinian media, but even in places like the New York Times. Yes, Nora.
Again, Michael, misinformation here too. So you mentioned that these people approach what is internationally recognized borders. I believe that the borders of 1967 are not internationally recognized.
Well,
Yes.
I mean, that's your view, but according to...
It's not my view, it's actually the United Nations view. Did they recognize the 1967 new borders that was imposed? I don't believe so.
They recognized the 1949 armistice lines.
Not 67, Michael. I think the border of Gaza and the West Bank were not recognized. Even Jerusalem is still supposed to be Palestinian, totally. It's not recognized by the international community.
This is exactly what I'm saying, Nora. That the Gaza Strip is not recognized as part of Israel, but on the eastern side of the boundary between the Gaza Strip and Israel, that is recognized as 48 Israel. And the international community does not recognize any Israeli sovereignty or occupation over the whole of the Gaza Strip, the whole of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Those are considered occupied Palestinian territories. I'm not sure who you're disagreeing with.
No, I'm just trying to make a connection between what is presenting here with the idea of irregular migration. To be honest, I didn't find any connection, and it's misinformed if this could be the case of these people trying to cross the borders. I'm not sure how we can define borders in this case, because this is like not, as you mentioned, not internationally recognized borders.
No, the international community does recognize this as Israel's international border. It's what Israel on the map. It doesn't include the Gaza Strip or the West Bank or East Jerusalem.
Okay, but what about the idea of irregular migration that these people are trying to cross or to do?
They are yes, but they're not trying to migrate and become Israeli, but they are rejecting the authority of the state to say that they can't move. And if the military border wall infrastructure wasn't so strong, they would be sneaking in through, across the field, but Israel has completely locked them out. So they have to confront the border head on with their bodies in their protest of the state ability to restrict the movement of human beings. So it's a very frontal challenge on the state authority to impose borders and corral where people can live in an extreme form of the very same phenomenon that I'm suggesting that is driving a lot of irregular migration in the world today.
Okay, but I think you missed the idea behind this great march of return in Gaza. They wasn't actually trying to cross because they want to cross to the historic land as much as opposing the siege that was imposed in 2005.
Yes.
So this is the main idea that has to be actually presented here, that people have been held like prisoners in a free prison since 2005 and trying to get out, So this was some of the reactions more than like an idea or an attempt to cross to the historic lands of Palestine.
Yes, I mean, they called it the Great March of Return because the idea is with 80% of Gaza's 2 million people, not actually from that part of Palestine, but 80% of the people living in Gaza were pushed there as displaced people as a result of the founding of Israel. And though 80% of the people have their eyes on their homeland, their homes, their farms, their villages, even if they're destroyed on the other side of the barrier. So they are trying to cross. Their message is the blockade is illegitimate. Israel is illegitimate. We get to cross back into our homeland and restore Palestine. That's what their message is. But the frontal assault is happening on the Israeli border infrastructure as they're rejecting the Israeli state's ability to exclude.
And I think you have some kind of a background on why these movements have been faced with very aggressive, violent reactions from the IDF. Do you know why? Even though that they were like peaceful and most of the time, like 99% of the time, people like this with kids and children trying, to express their intent in a peaceful way. But as you mentioned, there were hundreds of cases they were shot and killed or injured.
Yes. Oh yeah, and I have a couple more pictures here that illustrate this. Here's another picture from the Great March of Return. This one shows in the foreground the snipers on an embankment, and you can see in the background. This is a very long-range field shot, so you're seeing a span of hundreds of meters in this image. But you can see the unarmed demonstrators, men, women, children approaching, and the Israeli forces lining up as if they're being approached by an invading army. And the Palestinian resistance at the border got quite creative. To call it nonviolent is certainly the majority of it was nonviolent, but the Palestinians are very much active and militant in their approach to defying the Israeli occupation. And so they will throw stones, they will throw small incendiary devices. And what's happening in this amazing photo is a drone camera is capturing the field as Palestinians have laid out hundreds of piles of tires to burn. When the wind was right, they would light these things on fire to blow towards the Israeli side of the border fence.
I think one important thing to say here of this is the proportionality and the real imbalance. So whereas they have snipers, drones,
Yes.
full militarized border,
Yes.
they're burning tires. It's not the same.
It's not.
Their type of defiance and resistance can't be really considered truly militant.
No.
It's the
Not
last
militarized,
resort.
but maybe I should be careful with the word militant, but
It's literally the last
militant
resort.
means activists who have a determination to get focused. They're thinking strategically. They're organizing. It's not militarized, but militant in the sense of dedicated
I think
activism.
resistance.
This is resistance.
It's
It's
resistance.
unarmed resistance.
It's last
It's
resort.
popular
resistance.
struggle. Yes. It's of the people. Yeah. On the whole, it's a kind of resistance that's characterized by the people, not by top-down politicians, not by militaries, and even not by armed groups. It was mostly predominantly this civil society organized campaign. And of course, I hope it goes without saying that we all understand that this is not a conflict between two countries. Palestine was erased off the map. They don't have a country. Palestine has never had a tank. They've never had a helicopter. They've never had a fighter jet. They've never had a military. I hope that it's implicit that we all sort of recognize that Israel is one of the world's most powerful militaries, and Palestinians are this unarmed, displaced people who are citizens of nowhere. They have no citizenship rights. They have no country to call home. So yes.
And Israel is highly strategic in how it kills us and how it polices their bodies. The amount of money and infrastructure put into their military from 1940. So that first ship that entered Palestine has been militant. And it's just become militant from day one, and it's escalated to the point where there's no equal ground. So there's no really, even the resistance.
In a normal situation, eventually, if this were a normal situation, Israel would eventually have had to have come to peace and made an agreement, recognized a Palestinian state, or made some major compromise on the right of return. But because they are backed by the most powerful empires in the world, they have continually never had to make any concessions. Not only do they have the military support of the West, they have the diplomatic support of the West, the economic support of the West. And this has been an unequivocal and unconditioned support, which means what incentive does Israel have to compromise? And this has exacerbated the imbalance in power and led to the crisis that we're in right now.
I mean, we're seeing a shift right now. Like, even if we walk outside this building, there's a Ubik encampment. So people are being more aware of where money goes towards, if it goes towards perpetuating this militarization of colonial power. So I think there's a little bit more awareness about it, but the fact that it's taken 75 years almost to come to this realization.
Yes.
And it's from all streams of life.
Yes. And, just photographically, you can see the similarities. This is an instance from Hungary at the, was it Hungary-Serbia border, I think, in 2015, when migrants were able to break through the fence. These are migrants involved in the refugee crisis from North Africa, from Syria, and they've taken the Balkan route, and they're able to breach the fence, and they're men, women, children, families are trying to make it into Europe where they can feel like they can reach some safety. And the state is trying to keep them out with these same familiar repressive technologies of border fences and militarization, and the people crossing through, they're not maybe saying, oh, I want a more just world for free immigration. They're thinking of their families, their private concerns, but there's something profoundly political happening here as a defiance of the state with a capital S authority to restrict the motion of human beings who are in need and have a right to move. And another parallel, I hope everyone is aware of the migrant caravans that became sort of a fascinating tactic for migrants to band together in numbers as they moved up from Central America through Mexico towards the US border, to travel in numbers, safety in numbers. Not only safety in numbers, a bigger message. You make the news, you are reaching more communities who might not have understood this situation because of the sheer spectacle of this organized activity of irregular migration. They are saying, we are coming to the border, we have the right to claim asylum, we have the right to access our family, and they're marching in these large groups. And take a look at this picture, famous picture right at the US border, that captures some of the chaos and mayhem of these people trying to get their families to a better place, and being, meeting the barbed wire and the tear gas, and images of, again, border fences and people. This, to me, this captures something of the essence. This is something like what was going on with the Berlin Wall. This is something like what's going on with Palestinian popular struggle to reject Israel's authority to put up walls and deny them access. And then it's not just the irregular motion that we kind of have to put a fancy interpretation on and think philosophically to link it in these ways, but there are overt protests that are sort of coupled with and in solidarity with these kinds of motions of people struggling to move without being confined to the regular channels, the authorized channels, the legal channels. And protesters who are coming from a position of privilege or within America itself are demonstrating in solidarity and saying, yes, we support the cause of people who are struggling for a right to move and a right to come here and claim asylum. And just one more example I have here, the similar scenes at the Greece-Turkey border in 2020, when Turkey was trying to exert some of its, trying to put some pressure on Europe and saying, hey, we can cause you headaches by opening the migrant valve. So again, we talked a little bit earlier in the week about how migrant populations and refugees and displaced people have been used as pawns in geopolitics of upstate powers. Turkey is guilty of the same thing, as it would, as containing migrants who are trying to reach Europe, and then periodically letting them through, not so much for humanitarian or benevolent reasons, but because they're playing these geopolitical games with Europe. And then so Greece responds with all of this brute force. Again, you see the militarized walls, the water cannons, tear gas. And so these scenes, I think, are all touching on a shared experience of what is maybe not quite overt or explicit in the mentality or the paradigm today, but I think is potentially becoming, and some have speculated, that the movements of irregular migrants, the challenges from below of populations defying the authority of states to build these walls and control their movement, may turn into the great civil rights struggle of the 21st century, a global civil rights struggle that could potentially lead to changing of our bounds or acceptance of the political community, just as it expands to include women through women's suffrage, as it expands to include minorities within countries, or the American civil rights movement extending the right to vote, that the next great enfranchisement is going to be doing away with national exclusions on borders. Now, this is by no means certain. It's just something that is a bit of a radical idea at this point. But these connections are bubbling up, and these movements have this fundamental rejection of the state authority to legally exclude, based on territory and nation.
These images at the border, the frictions at the borderlands, is, in your view, the next global struggle?
It could very well be. It could very well be.
I mean, but people have been talking about this for a while. This is an eminent kind of occurrence, but it's slow to take shape just because of the nation state defining so much of international relations and geopolitics for such an established time. And then it's also a little bit maybe not true, or maybe could not come true because of the idea of successionist movements and the need for states, and the idea of acquiring a state is still very much seen as legitimate endeavor by a lot of minority groups.
Yes.
So
including Palestinians.
Exactly, and also, yeah, so there is, and again, the nation state is a Western derived concept, so even maybe that itself needs to be.
But just to clarify, it doesn't, and this could be completely far-fetched, and the powers that be could overcome this. And these movements of people resisting borders, risking their lives to resist borders, suffering precarity and social ostracism within communities for being undocumented, but doing it nonetheless, it could continue to be marginalized for perpetuity. It could be repressed, and the modern, powerful, militarized nation state could prevail, and movements like this remain a footnote in history. But it's also potentially the case that it's not so much a movement against borders or states. It doesn't have to mean that this sort of the direction that this movement is going is to abolish states or lead to anarchism. It could just be about rejecting the national imperative to exclude. See, the idea of a nation says that a particular group of people, and only that group of people, has a say on how the border is governed. And if we expand or dismantle, deconstruct the notion of nationalism, it's possible that borders could be governed by all affected by them, not just those with the right nationality. Now, this may be pie in the sky stuff, and it may never materialize or coalesce into a coherent social movement, but this is certainly where I would say a lot of the plight of many millions of people is derived in the state's ability to exclude based on what nation they are. Oh, you're not in the right nationality, you don't have a right to pass through this border.
I think it's just,
Could you also repeat your comment you just said, because they couldn't hear you?
yeah, I'm sorry, I've been doing this all week long. I murmur a lot and I'm very quiet, but I was saying that to a lot of minority groups, ethnic, religious, that the state, the nation state, is still a prize, and especially when secessionist movements happen, it does become the thing to acquire. So can we really get rid of it if it's still seen as such a foundation of the international system? Even, I'm looking at my work when I looked at the creation of South Sudan, or even in South Asia, where I did my historical research on the creation of Bangladesh outside Pakistan, and then looking at how ethnic minority groups still see statehood as such something to be acquired. So I'm just trying to see if, and then once they do acquire statehood, it becomes a repetition of history, where they start drawing borders in a very, even though they were the ones who were. So I kind of think by nature, border drawing and border lands are restrictive.
Yes.
And they're meant to exclude, and the same thing with belonging, and it's meant to exclude. It's meant to be a very in-group practice. And that's the nature of the practice. And then I also saw the comment of these frameworks are very Western derived. So the participation of what is called the global South in them is also contested in what border drawing is. So yeah, just these thoughts.
I would just say, I don't oppose abolishing borders. I think borders are indispensable, but borders, wherever two different political jurisdictions meet, there's a seam zone where they connect. And so borders are where different political jurisdictions and regions interconnect. And so borders can say, okay, well, here in this part of the world, we want our housing zones to be this way and our trash to be picked up on these days. People have a right to self-govern. And but the question is, on what basis do you exclude the people over there who have a very good reason to be either passing through or coming to this land? And the criteria for exclusion is not the border itself, because borders are not inherently exclusive unless you put up a concrete wall with barbed wire. What is exclusive is, I guess what this comes down to is an argument, the debate between the open borders school of thought and the no borders school of thought. And if this sort of a global social movement were to coalesce or become more prominent, its end goal would not be, I think, abolishing of borders, because the only way you could think of a world without borders would be either a one world government or no government at all. And so the alternative then is not no borders, which is an anarchist, arguably utopian view, but open borders. The borders continue to exist, but subject to the democratic will of those whose lives it impacts, not just those with the right national ID. Now, I see Lily has a hand up. That's the end of my presentation. We are going to break pretty quickly for our break to do some practicum group work, but I would love to hear some other folks who haven't participated in this session yet to come in to share some unrelated thoughts or to pick up on any of the discussion points. Go ahead, Maria, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think on that last point, I don't think it's very feasible to like try to talk out or like borders no longer existing. But I do think that there's a way in which there are already some examples of like regional mobility. And obviously like I guess the European Union is the best example as we were discussing in the last section, but it requires like either significant investments in development of the countries that are like in on equal terms. And then obviously like not considering the colonial histories or whatever, but I think there's an argument to be made as a next step that is kind of not as extreme as saying like, oh, all borders are going to disappear, about regional mobility, and then also like kind of moving from the migration framework, which assumes that people want to always live in the place that they're going to move to, instead of thinking like, oh, maybe they just want to work there and like travel back and forth, and like more circular mobility schemes. That is one of the biggest problems out US-Mexico migration. Like they imposed all of these new rules for people that were basically traveling back and forth. So that's why they have to stay in the US as irregular migrants rather than continuing their cycles of mobility between the two countries, which is what happened kind of historically. So I don't know. I mean, it's obviously not an easy solution, but I do think thinking regionally, there are some examples besides Europe in like Mercosur and other places where that already happened. So maybe that's like a more feasible next step.
Yes, and this kind of comes back to the question of globalization, right? Globalization for who? And if globalization were truly democratized, then none of these seams would be able to exist, where states would be able to hold back populations in need of movement. So I mean, it's very. I recognize that this is counterintuitive and maybe a very early or immature formulation of a set of ideas, but this is starting to come out in some of the. See, for example, there's literature now trying to redescribe irregular migration and border descent as a kind of 21st century civil disobedience, as sort of a new kind of this is in order to move towards a more just or inclusive world, that we need to have these violations of the letter of the law, of the boundary, these international boundaries, not to dispute boundaries as such, but to dispute how they're governed and who they're governed for. Is there anyone else who wants to jump in? Otherwise, I would love to hear from Lily again.
Can I just say, I
Yeah, go
don't
ahead.
think I was clear enough. When I was speaking earlier, I was speaking to my understanding of borders beyond the Western context and trying to understand that as a result, as a colonial legacy in lots of parts of Asia and Africa, specifically South Asia, which I'm
And the
familiar
Middle
with.
East.
Yeah, so drawing that boundary and that border was very arbitrary, perpetuating it was very arbitrary. So then does it really make sense to even create an open zone or regional when there's not a lot of, it was intentionally intended that each country be its own unit and there not be a lot of interaction. So how can you now pose that there would be a lot of cooperation within a region when it was never occurred? We talked earlier this week about people from India not being able to go to Pakistan, not being able to go to Bangladesh. So it's very easy in some places of the world, like Europe, where you can travel freely amongst countries, and places like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, where you can't even move, even for religious reasons, across boundaries. So boundaries and borders being very restrictive in some parts of the world, and the luxury to have free borders in other parts of the world. I think it's an interesting take on it. And the implication that nation states are mandatory for people who are part of a colonial legacy, and gaining independence and that history really informs how you value nation states and their borders. Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify my point earlier.
Lily, can you jump in?
Yeah, I think I'm really interested in what Warda is saying, and I think like part of what we're talking about is also just expanding, our concept of what a border or a national body could be. I think like I don't know, and sounds like the consensus in the room is that, talking about abolishing the state is very extreme. But I think also recognizing that like there's a huge spectrum of systems of governance, not all of which are constituted as nation states, even within nation states. And obviously, I feel very ignorant of some of the regions that we're discussing. I really only know the US and Mexico, but in Mexico, there's a national or a liberation movement that is the Zapatistas, and they talk about autonomy for their groups within the structure of the state. Their aim is not to establish a separate state. So, but their communities are bordered. They're like small, villages with surrounding terrain in the south of Mexico, and you can't just like stroll up and go inside. Like they're not arguing for a stateless structure that also has no borders. They're arguing for autonomy, which is a concept related to self-determination, and in which they're like and they're not reinventing the wheel, because they have like a historic system of governance from pre-colonial times. But yeah, I think like it's important also, just I think sometimes we talk about this stuff, it's like trying to imagine a new future with starting from scratch. And like maybe this is related to what Warda is saying, like there's a lot of other ways of doing things that maybe aren't well known or discussed in the same degree of seriousness with the same degree of like rigor, because we're writing from a Western perspective, but like they do exist. And so like, the Zapatistas I think have been written on a lot in Mexico and in US and leftist movements in the US. But yeah, I think that like it's difficult to argue for a system of autonomous, like basically anarcho-syndicalist village governance, and in a country like the United States, which is largely comprised of immigrants that don't agree on very much. Like there's not the same historical reference where people could look back and say, we share all of these views and these values, and we share this land, and we have this idea of how we want to live, because people have very diverse ideas about how they want to live. So I think also just like maybe letting go a little bit of like the idea that there is a universal solution for how these kinds of problems could be solved, but that like when we talk about border resistance or like ways of bordering or different kinds of discourses that oppose unfairly imposed militarized state borders, that's not necessarily like, I feel like sometimes it's like, oh, if you say that, then it means you want to abolish a state, or if you say that, it means whatever, it means you support this or that. And like really there's like such a large variety of possible ways of living, ways of governing, ways of organizing, that I think sometimes our discussions can be kind of contained to what we know best. And certainly as an American, like what I know best is like a state system, but they've had the privilege to like get to know some of these other ways of organizing, I think do provide like certain clues or like things we could learn from, even if they can't be implemented like exactly as they exist in these contexts, in the context that I'm from.
I think those are great points. The open borders, no borders debate, I think helps to highlight some differences in conceptual thinking, but it's a dangerous binary. And I don't think that we should get trapped in the either or view of either no borders at all or open borders, because there are all these different models of governance that nobody is even really talking about. And you pointed to a few, like the Zapatistas. I think also about a kind of anarcho-syndicalism, which is sort of a rejection of the hierarchical state, but not a rejection of governance. I think about sort of the Murray Bookchin approach that has influenced some of the Kurdish national secular organizing, that has developed these states that are grassroots and bottom up rather than top down. So there are ways of thinking about governance that don't fall into utopian or nation state binaries. That's a great point.